We've all had the dangers of inegalitarian racism drummed into us constantly, so much so that the dangers of egalitarian assumptions, in this sense meaning that all identifiable races, sexes, ethnic groups, etc. are cognitively equal, have been ignored. For example, let's say Sweden wants to bring in 1 million black Africans under the assumption that by speaking the same language, going to the same schools, and being in the same quote-unquote cultural milieu, over time these immigrants will become black Swedes. Behaviorally indistinguishable from white Swedes, they'll just look a little bit different. What if this is wrong? What if their behavior is innately distinct from that of white Swedes, and the current violent crime rates, drainage on the government budget, and support for socialist parties that these black immigrants have are a result of something innate and, for the foreseeable future, permanent? We could look at affirmative action. Affirmative action is predicated on the notion that the identified races are cognitively equal, and therefore any performance disparity is treated as prima facie evidence that the performance gaps are a result of discrimination, which has morphed into this invisible and unverifiable implicit discrimination, or the effects of prior oppression, which can't be verified or falsified, or some invisible system of white privilege. Anything but innate genetic differences. All this leads to egalitarian racism. Examples of egalitarian racism would be the attacks on Chinese in Malaysia, Armenians in Turkey, Jews throughout the Middle East and later in Europe, and today, whites just about everywhere. And I'm sure there are many more examples of egalitarian racism, the use of presumed equality to attack the economically successful. Now, I was an egalitarian, as that is the default. That's what you're taught in school. That's what most people's parents tell their kids. It is the starting point. And so to have gone from this starting point to something else means that you have to have broken out of and overcome a society-wide egalitarian bias. And this happened when I simply analyzed the proposition of racial equality from a disinterested standpoint. You have these populations, call them racist or not, that doesn't matter. There is genetic variation. This variation clusters into semi-discrete populations, and self-identified race within the US at least corresponds almost perfectly with genetic ancestry. Luis Cavalli-Sforza says race doesn't exist, but then goes on to talk about the various human populations, which just so happen to correspond with the classical racial categories. Whatever. You don't like to use the word race? Fine, let's not use the word race. So these populations are different. They're different in many ways. They're different in skin color, hair texture and hair color, susceptibility and immunities to certain diseases and conditions, differences in bone structure, differences in muscle mass and distribution, fat mass and distribution, and differences in cranial capacity. So despite all of these differences, including differences in average cranial capacity, we are to presume cognitive equality between the population averages of these semi-discrete populations, even though we recognize profound innate differences between individuals. Now, you don't have to think bigger brains are, all else being equal, better than smaller brains. Perhaps it is Africans who have innately the smartest brains because they have more tightly packed neurons. And all I am saying is that the presumption that they are all equal, that all of these groups are equal, would be a cosmic fluke, an impossible joke of a coincidence. Nature doesn't do equal. Pointing out failings or misuse of studies by people that you think are quote-unquote racist does not change the fundamental impossibility of the egalitarian position, nor can one honestly make policy proposals based on egalitarian assumptions.